My wife tried a fake divorce to test my loyalty. I should have known something was up when Camila set the table with our good plates on a random Tuesday evening, the ones we usually saved for anniversaries or when her mother visited from Tucson. She'd even lit candles, which struck me as odd since we typically saved romance for weekends when we weren't both exhausted from our respective jobs at competing marketing firms in Phoenix. I work in data analytics while she handles creative campaigns, and our dinner conversations usually revolve around client deadlines, campaign metrics, and the occasional office gossip rather than intimate heart-to-hearts about our relationship or future plans together. That evening felt different though, charged with an energy I couldn't quite place as I watched her fidget with her wedding ring throughout our meal of takeout Thai food from our usual place on Camelback Road that somehow felt more formal and deliberate than our typical weeknight routine. Her phone kept buzzing against the table every few minutes, the screen lighting up with messages she'd glance at quickly before flipping it face down with obvious irritation and what looked like barely contained anxiety. I assumed it was work since her latest campaign for a luxury resort chain in Sedona had been consuming most of her attention lately, requiring late nights and weekend calls with demanding clients, but the frequency of the notifications seemed excessive even for her notoriously demanding supervisor who was known throughout their office for sending messages at all hours. When I asked about the constant interruptions, she waved them off as book club drama, mentioning something about Jasmine having boyfriend issues again and the group needing to provide emotional support through their group chat. The book club had become increasingly important to Camila over the past 6 months, meeting twice weekly at various upscale coffee shops around Scottsdale to discuss relationship psychology books that seemed to focus more on testing partners and analyzing relationship dynamics than actual literature or meaningful discussion about themes and characters. I'd never paid much attention to their discussions, assuming it was typical friend group bonding over shared experiences, mutual support, and the kind of advice-giving that women friends often engage in when navigating romantic relationships. These meetings had started interfering with our date nights, and Camila would often come home energized and full of theories about relationship dynamics that she'd learned from whatever book they'd dissected that week. She'd started using phrases like emotional intelligence assessment and loyalty validation that didn't sound like her natural vocabulary but rather like concepts she'd absorbed from self-help literature. Halfway through dinner, after we'd exhausted small talk about my latest data project and her resort campaign, Camila suddenly straightened in her chair and cleared her throat in a way that reminded me exactly of how she presented campaign proposals to particularly difficult clients when she needed to maintain professional composure. She looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between determined and nervous, like someone about to deliver news they'd been dreading. Then she announced that she wanted a divorce, the words coming out too quickly and too clearly, like she'd been practicing them in the mirror for hours until she'd perfected the delivery. Her timing felt calculated and deliberate, delivered right after I'd complimented the spring rolls and settled back in my chair, as if she'd been waiting for the perfect moment when my guard was down to drop this bombshell into our otherwise pleasant evening. The inflection in her voice sounded more like she was delivering a rehearsed presentation than ending our 4-year marriage, and there was something almost theatrical about the way she held eye contact while delivering what should have been one of the most difficult conversations of our lives. I set down my chopsticks and studied her face carefully, noting how her eyes kept darting toward her still buzzing phone and the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass with movements that seemed more nervous than sad. Instead of the shock, desperate pleading, or emotional breakdown she seemed to expect based on her prepared posture and expectant expression, I simply nodded calmly and told her that if that's truly what she wanted, I understood completely and wouldn't fight her decision or try to change her mind. The reaction on her face was immediate and unmistakable, genuine surprise mixed with something that looked almost like panic, as if my calm acceptance and lack of emotional reaction had completely derailed whatever script she'd been following or outcome she'd anticipated. Her phone exploded with notifications at that exact moment, the screen lighting up repeatedly with what I could clearly see were group chat messages from her book club friends with names like Jasmine, Rachel, and Monica appearing on the lock screen, and I suddenly realized this conversation had an audience of women waiting eagerly for updates on how their carefully orchestrated little experiment was progressing. That's when I calmly informed her that I'd known for weeks about her inappropriate relationship with her supervisor at the marketing firm, watching as her face went completely pale and her phone continued buzzing with what I now understood were frantic messages from friends who had no idea their loyalty test had just backfired spectacularly by exposing something much more serious than they'd bargained for. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the persistent buzzing of her phone and the distant sound of traffic outside our townhouse windows. Camila's carefully rehearsed composure crumbled instantly, replaced by the look of someone who just realized their elaborate plan had not only failed but had actually accelerated the very outcome they'd been trying to avoid. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to process how her friend's brilliant loyalty test had instead given me the perfect opening to address the real issue that had been eating away at our marriage for months. Her book club had been so focused on testing my devotion and commitment that they'd completely overlooked the fact that their orchestrated drama was about to expose the actual betrayal that had been hiding beneath the surface of our seemingly stable relationship. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to manufacture a crisis to test my loyalty, they'd stumbled directly into revealing the genuine crisis that already existed. Camila's phone screen lit up again with another barrage of messages, and I could see fragments of text from Jasmine asking how I was reacting and whether I was begging her to reconsider, completely unaware that their carefully planned manipulation had just blown up in their faces in the most spectacular way possible. The whole elaborate scheme suddenly seemed so transparent and juvenile, like something college students might devise after reading too many relationship advice articles online rather than the sophisticated psychological experiment they'd apparently convinced themselves it was. I decided to explain exactly how I discovered her betrayal, watching as each detail landed like another blow to her carefully constructed facade. My coworker Emma from the analytics department had shown me months of flirtatious text messages between Camila and her supervisor Marcus, screenshots that Emma had obtained through their mutual friend who worked in Camila's office and had grown concerned about the increasingly inappropriate workplace dynamic. The messages revealed late-night conversations that had nothing to do with marketing campaigns, secret lunch meetings at upscale restaurants across town, and intimate discussions about their personal lives that crossed every professional boundary imaginable. Emma had initially hesitated to show me the evidence, knowing how devastating it would be, but eventually decided I deserved to know the truth about what my wife was doing during those extended work hours and weekend client meetings that had become suspiciously frequent over the past few months. As I recounted the timeline of discovery, Camila's phone continued its relentless buzzing with messages from her book club conspirators who were clearly expecting regular updates on how their loyalty test was progressing according to whatever timeline they'd established during their coffee shop plotting sessions. I could see Jasmine's name appearing repeatedly on the screen, along with messages that probably contained encouragement about staying strong and not backing down from their orchestrated divorce announcement until they'd sufficiently tested my commitment to the marriage. The irony was almost amusing. Here they were, frantically messaging about testing my loyalty while completely oblivious to the fact that their carefully planned manipulation had instead exposed the actual disloyalty that had been destroying our relationship from the inside. I explained how Emma had documented not just the inappropriate messages but also the pattern of behavior that had emerged over months, including Camila's sudden interest in working late on projects that mysteriously required constant communication with Marcus outside normal business hours. There were photos from company events where they stood too close together, evidence of lunch dates disguised as client meetings, and a trail of small lies about work obligations that coincided perfectly with times when Camila claimed to be handling urgent campaign deadlines. The book club's fake divorce request was clearly supposed to be their masterstroke, the ultimate test that would prove either my unwavering devotion or provide them with evidence that I wasn't worthy of Camila's loyalty, but instead it had given me the perfect opportunity to address months of actual betrayal that I'd been carefully documenting while deciding how to handle the situation. I told Camila how I'd spent weeks planning my own approach to confronting her infidelity, weighing whether to demand explanations, suggest counseling, or simply end things quietly, but her friend's interference had accelerated the timeline by forcing the issue in the most dramatic way possible. Her phone screen lit up again with what appeared to be increasingly frantic messages from the book club group chat, and I could imagine the panic spreading among her co-conspirators as they realized their loyalty test had gone completely off script. They'd probably expected me to be devastated, to beg for another chance, to promise to be a better husband if only Camila would reconsider, but instead their manufactured crisis had become the catalyst for exposing the real crisis that had been festering beneath the surface of our marriage for months. Camila finally found her voice and started stammering about how the messages with Marcus were just friendly workplace banter, how the lunch meetings were legitimate business discussions about campaign strategies, and how I was misinterpreting innocent professional relationships through the lens of suspicion and jealousy. But the evidence Emma had shown me was too comprehensive and damning for such weak explanations, including screenshots of conversations where Camila had complained about feeling unappreciated at home and had expressed curiosity about what life might be like with someone who understood her creative ambitions better than her analytical husband ever could. The book club had clearly convinced themselves they were conducting some sophisticated psychological experiment to strengthen our marriage by testing my dedication, but their manipulation had instead provided the perfect opening for me to address the genuine betrayal that had been slowly poisoning our relationship while they were busy planning their amateur dramatics. As I finished explaining the full scope of what I knew about her relationship with Marcus, Camila's phone buzzed once more with messages from friends who had no idea their loyalty test had just exposed the very disloyalty they'd been trying to measure. The silence stretched between us as she processed that her elaborate deception had been exposed through her own friend's misguided attempt to test my commitment to a marriage she'd already been undermining through her emotional affair. I could see her mind racing, trying to find some way to shift blame away from her actual betrayal, but the evidence was too comprehensive for any reasonable explanation that didn't involve acknowledging her inappropriate relationship with her supervisor. Her book club conspirators were probably still huddled around their phones, refreshing the group chat and waiting anxiously for updates about how their psychological experiment was unfolding, completely unaware that their loyalty test had become the mechanism through which months of actual infidelity were finally being addressed. The timing was almost poetic in its irony. They'd chosen this evening to test whether I truly loved their friend enough to fight for our marriage, only to discover that the marriage they were trying to preserve had already been compromised by the very person they were attempting to help. Camila finally broke the silence by attempting to minimize the significance of her relationship with Marcus, explaining that workplace friendships often involve personal conversations and that I was reading too much into meaningless interactions between colleagues who shared similar creative interests. She insisted that the lunch meetings were legitimate business discussions and that the late-night text conversations were simply brainstorming sessions. But Emma had shown me specific examples that went far beyond professional collaboration, including messages where Camila had described feeling emotionally disconnected from me and had expressed curiosity about whether Marcus understood her artistic vision better than her husband ever could. The book club's fake divorce announcement had been intended as the culmination of weeks of planning about testing relationship dynamics, but instead it had become the opening through which all their friends' actual relationship problems were finally being forced into the light where they could no longer be ignored. I explained to Camila that I'd been aware of the gradual changes in her behavior for months, the increased secrecy about her work schedule, the defensive reactions when I asked about specific projects, and the way she'd started treating our home life as something to endure rather than enjoy while investing her emotional energy elsewhere. Her phone continued buzzing with messages from Jasmine and the other book club members who were probably growing increasingly concerned about the lack of updates and wondering whether their loyalty test was proceeding according to plan, but none of their amateur psychology preparation had accounted for the possibility that their target might already know about actual betrayal that rendered their fake betrayal completely irrelevant. Despite Camila's desperate attempts to explain away her relationship with Marcus as innocent workplace collaboration, I methodically began packing my belongings while she followed me around our townhouse pleading for another chance to make things right between us. She kept insisting that the divorce request had been just a test designed by her book club to strengthen our marriage, as if that somehow made the manipulation more acceptable or negated the months of emotional infidelity I'd already documented through Emma's evidence. I pulled clothes from our shared dresser and folded them carefully into my largest suitcase, maintaining the same calm efficiency I used when organizing data spreadsheets at work, while Camila alternated between tearful apologies for the fake divorce scheme and increasingly frantic denials about the significance of her relationship with her supervisor. Her phone had finally stopped buzzing as frequently, which suggested that her co-conspirators were either giving her space to handle the situation or had realized their loyalty test had gone catastrophically wrong and were distancing themselves from the fallout. I told her that even if the divorce request had been completely fabricated, which I seriously doubted given the convenient timing with her escalating affair, her willingness to participate in such elaborate emotional manipulation revealed a fundamental lack of respect for our marriage that made reconciliation impossible. She tried arguing that all couples go through rough patches and that her friendship with Marcus had simply been a way of coping with feeling disconnected from me, but I pointed out that healthy relationships involve direct communication about problems rather than seeking emotional intimacy outside the marriage while staging fake crises to test your partner's devotion. When I moved to the kitchen to pack the coffee maker I'd bought specifically because she preferred French press over drip coffee, Camila blocked my path and begged me to consider couples counseling, promising that she would cut off all contact with Marcus and dedicate herself to rebuilding the trust she'd destroyed through her poor choices. I explained that trust wasn't something you could rebuild through promises and good intentions after it had been systematically dismantled through months of lies, secret communications, and emotional betrayal, especially when the person asking for forgiveness had just attempted to manipulate me through an elaborate loyalty test orchestrated with her friends. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was asking for loyalty and commitment from someone whose loyalty she just tried to test through fake divorce papers while simultaneously conducting an emotional affair that demonstrated her own complete lack of loyalty to our marriage vows. I continued packing methodically, including the small appliances we'd purchased together and the books from my side of our shared bookshelf, while explaining that I was moving to my friend Marcus's apartment temporarily until I could find my own place and figure out the logistics of officially ending our marriage. The name similarity between her supervisor and my friend wasn't lost on either of us, and she actually had the audacity to suggest that maybe subconsciously I'd been influenced by jealousy over sharing a name, as if my objection to her emotional affair was based on some petty rivalry rather than legitimate concerns about her betrayal and dishonesty. When I returned the next morning to collect more belongings and some important documents from our home office, Camila's mother Helen was waiting in our living room with a stern expression and what appeared to be a prepared speech about young marriages facing challenges and the importance of fighting for love instead of giving up at the first sign of trouble. I respected Helen and had always gotten along well with her during family gatherings and holiday visits, but I wasn't interested in being lectured about commitment by someone who didn't know the full scope of her daughter's betrayal and manipulation. I calmly explained to Helen that this wasn't a case of giving up over minor disagreements or normal relationship challenges, but rather a situation where Camila had been conducting an emotional affair with her supervisor while simultaneously orchestrating an elaborate loyalty test with her friends that demonstrated a pattern of dishonesty and manipulation that made continuing the marriage impossible. Helen's expression shifted from stern disapproval to shocked confusion as I outlined the timeline of Camila's relationship with Marcus and the evidence Emma had provided, along with the details of how the fake divorce request had been planned and executed with input from the book club members who thought they were conducting some kind of relationship psychology experiment. I could see Helen processing this information and realizing that her daughter's version of events had conveniently omitted crucial details about her own behavior while painting me as someone who was abandoning the marriage over communication problems and temporary challenges. Multiple friends from Camila's book club started calling throughout that week, each attempting their own version of damage control and trying to convince me that the loyalty test had been well-intentioned even if poorly executed. But I blocked their numbers and made it clear through mutual friends that I had no interest in discussing my marriage with the same people who had helped orchestrate its destruction. The phone calls and text messages from Jasmine, Rachel, Monica, and the other book club members revealed how deeply they'd been involved in planning the fake divorce scheme, with each one offering slightly different versions of events that suggested they'd spent considerable time discussing my relationship and analyzing my character without my knowledge or consent. Their interference had accelerated a confrontation I'd been planning to have with Camila about her emotional affair, but instead of allowing me to address the issue on my own terms and timeline, their manipulation had forced everything into the open in the most dramatic and destructive way possible. ensuring that any chance of working through our problems privately and maturely had been eliminated by their amateur psychology experiment that had backfired so spectacularly it would probably become a cautionary tale shared among their future book club discussions about relationship advice gone wrong. I made it clear to everyone involved that the marriage was over not because I'd failed some loyalty test or couldn't handle relationship challenges, but because Camila's pattern of dishonesty, emotional betrayal, and willingness to manipulate me through elaborate schemes demonstrated fundamental character flaws that made her unsuitable as a life partner, regardless of whatever self-help psychology books had convinced her friends that testing partners was an acceptable way to strengthen relationships. Within a week of moving out, I hired attorney Rodriguez, who specialized in no-fault divorces and had the papers prepared while Camila continued her desperate campaign of reconciliation attempts through daily phone calls, surprise visits to my temporary apartment, and increasingly dramatic social media posts about fighting for true love and not giving up on marriage during difficult times. Her posts were clearly designed to garner sympathy from friends and family who didn't know the full story, painting herself as someone whose husband had abandoned their marriage over a simple misunderstanding rather than someone who had been conducting an emotional affair while orchestrating elaborate loyalty tests with her book club conspirators. I instructed Rodriguez to have Camila served with divorce papers at her marketing firm during regular business hours, knowing that the public nature of the service would create exactly the kind of workplace drama that someone who'd been conducting an inappropriate relationship with her supervisor would want to avoid at all costs. The timing was deliberate and calculated, designed to ensure maximum professional embarrassment for someone who had shown no consideration for my dignity when planning fake divorce requests and emotional manipulation schemes with her friends over coffee dates and book club meetings. According to Emma, who provided regular updates about the office dynamics at Camila's firm, the process server's arrival created immediate buzz among her colleagues who were already gossiping about her relationship with Marcus and speculating about whether their frequent lunch meetings and after-hours communications were crossing professional boundaries in ways that could create liability issues for the company. The public serving of divorce papers essentially confirmed what many of her co-workers had already suspected about her personal life bleeding into her professional responsibilities, and the timing couldn't have been worse since Marcus was already under scrutiny from human resources for his management style and tendency to blur the lines between personal and professional relationships with female subordinates. Emma reported that Camila's reaction to being served was visible to most of the office, involving tears, frantic phone calls, and what appeared to be a mild panic attack as she realized that her elaborate loyalty test had not only failed to strengthen her marriage but had actually accelerated its legal dissolution in the most public and humiliating way possible. The HR department immediately launched an investigation into Marcus's conduct after multiple employees reported feeling uncomfortable about the obvious favoritism he'd shown toward Camila and the unprofessional nature of their interactions during company meetings and office events. The investigation revealed a pattern of inappropriate boundary crossing that extended beyond just Camila to include other female employees who had felt pressured to engage in personal conversations and social activities outside work hours as a condition of receiving favorable assignments and performance reviews. Marcus faced potential termination not just for his relationship with Camila, but for creating a hostile work environment where female employees felt they needed to navigate inappropriate personal advances in order to succeed professionally, turning what he probably thought was harmless flirtation into a serious liability issue for the entire marketing firm. Meanwhile, Camila's book club completely imploded as the members began blaming each other for the failed loyalty test and the devastating consequences that had resulted from their amateur psychology experiment gone wrong. Jasmine, who had apparently been the primary architect of the fake divorce scheme, found herself ostracized by the other members who felt she had manipulated them into participating in something that destroyed a marriage rather than strengthening it as she had promised when convincing them to help with her elaborate plan. Rachel and Monica, who had helped craft the specific wording and timing of the divorce announcement, were dealing with guilt and regret over their roles in what they now realized had been a cruel manipulation disguised as relationship advice, especially after learning about Camila's emotional affair, which revealed that their loyalty test had been conducted on someone who was already being disloyal to her marriage. The book club's weekly meetings became increasingly tense as members argued about who bore responsibility for the disaster, with some blaming Jasmine's influence and others questioning why none of them had considered the potential consequences of encouraging someone to fake a divorce request as a way of testing their partner's commitment. The group eventually disbanded entirely when several members realized they could no longer trust each other's judgment about relationship advice and didn't want to be associated with the kind of manipulative behavior that had characterized their involvement in Camila's marriage destruction. I maintained firm boundaries throughout this period, refusing Camila's requests for face-to-face meetings to discuss reconciliation and declining her mother Helen's attempts to mediate what she still believed was a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication and mutual forgiveness. Instead, I documented every attempt at contact and every violation of the boundaries I'd established, creating a comprehensive record that demonstrated the pattern of manipulation and harassment that continued even after I'd made my position crystal clear about the marriage being irretrievably broken due to her choices and actions. Camila began spreading alternative narratives about our divorce among mutual friends, claiming that I had been emotionally distant and unsupportive of her career ambitions, and suggesting that my discovery of her friendship with Marcus had triggered an irrational jealousy response that prevented me from seeing the situation clearly or giving her a chance to explain the innocent nature of their professional relationship. These attempts to rewrite history and shift blame away from her own behavior only reinforced my decision to end the marriage, since they demonstrated that she still hadn't accepted responsibility for her emotional affair and continued to view herself as the victim of circumstances rather than someone who had made deliberate choices that destroyed her marriage through dishonesty and betrayal. Her refusal to acknowledge the severity of her actions or take genuine accountability for the pain she'd caused made any possibility of reconciliation impossible, even if I had been inclined to consider giving her another chance after everything she'd put me through with her elaborate manipulation schemes and months of deception about her relationship with Marcus. The contrast between her public narrative of being an abandoned wife whose husband couldn't handle relationship challenges and the reality of someone who had orchestrated fake divorce requests while conducting emotional affairs revealed a level of self-deception and manipulation that extended far beyond our marriage into every aspect of how she presented herself to the world. I realized that the woman I thought I'd married either never existed or had been carefully hidden behind a facade of vulnerability and devotion that she'd maintained until she felt secure enough in the relationship to reveal her true character through her willingness to test, manipulate, and ultimately betray the trust I'd placed in her over 4 years of what I'd believed was genuine partnership and mutual respect. The professional consequences for Camila and Marcus continued to escalate over the following weeks as their workplace became increasingly uncomfortable for both of them, with Marcus ultimately receiving a formal reprimand and mandatory transfer to a different department while Camila found herself isolated from colleagues who no longer trusted her judgment or wanted to be associated with the office scandal that had emerged from her personal life drama. Emma reported that Camila had been reassigned to work on smaller, less prestigious accounts after her supervisor's transfer, essentially marking her as someone whose poor decision-making had created liability issues for the firm and whose career advancement would be limited as long as she remained with the company. The marketing firm's leadership clearly viewed the entire situation as a cautionary tale about maintaining professional boundaries and had implemented new policies about workplace relationships and social media conduct that were directly inspired by the chaos Camila and Marcus had created through their inappropriate interactions. Marcus faced even more severe consequences when the HR investigation revealed that his pattern of boundary violations extended beyond just Camila to include several other female employees who had felt uncomfortable about his management style and expectations for personal interaction outside normal work requirements. His mandatory transfer came with a formal notation in his personnel file about inappropriate conduct, effectively ending any prospects for promotion within the company and serving as a warning that future violations would result in immediate termination regardless of his performance in other areas. The investigation also revealed that Marcus had been using company resources, including business lunch budgets and client entertainment expenses, to fund some of his personal meetings with Camila, turning their emotional affair into a potential embezzlement issue that required additional scrutiny from the firm's accounting department. Meanwhile, Emma continued providing updates about Camila's deteriorating situation at work, describing how her colleagues had begun excluding her from team meetings and social activities while treating her with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for someone whose judgment could no longer be trusted. The workplace gossip had evolved beyond just speculation about her relationship with Marcus to include questions about her stability and decision-making abilities, particularly after details about the fake divorce scheme became known among her coworkers who struggled to understand why someone would orchestrate such elaborate manipulation in their personal life. Camila's isolation at work mirrored her social isolation as former friends distanced themselves from someone whose behavior had become increasingly erratic and manipulative, with several mutual acquaintances expressing concern about her tendency to blame others for consequences that resulted directly from her own choices. The book club's complete dissolution had eliminated her primary social support network, leaving her without the echo chamber of enablers who had encouraged her loyalty testing schemes and convinced her that manipulating her husband was an acceptable way to address relationship concerns. Jasmine, the primary architect of the fake divorce plan, had actually reached out to me through a mutual friend to apologize for her role in the disaster, admitting that the loyalty test had been her idea and expressing genuine remorse for the damage their interference had caused to what she now realized had been a marriage already struggling with issues that required honest communication rather than elaborate psychological experiments. During this awkward phone conversation, Jasmine revealed that she'd been going through her own relationship problems and had projected her insecurities onto Camila's marriage, convincing herself and the other book club members that testing partners was a legitimate relationship strategy rather than recognizing it as the manipulative behavior it actually represented. She begged me to forgive her involvement and asked if there was anything she could do to help repair the damage, but I explained that the loyalty test had simply accelerated a confrontation that was inevitable given Camila's emotional affair, and that their interference had actually prevented any possibility of addressing our problems privately and maturely. I refused to absolve Jasmine of her guilt or provide her with the forgiveness she was seeking, explaining that her amateur psychology experiment had contributed to the destruction of a marriage and that the consequences of her actions were something she would need to live with rather than expecting absolution from the people she'd helped harm. The conversation reinforced my understanding of how the book club had functioned as an echo chamber where poorly informed relationship advice was amplified and validated without consideration for the real-world consequences of implementing manipulative strategies disguised as psychological insights. Emma's workplace updates also revealed that Camila had begun spreading false narratives about emotional abuse and financial control, claiming that I had been manipulative and controlling throughout our marriage in ways that justified her emotional affair and explained why she'd felt compelled to seek validation and support outside our relationship. These attempts to reframe her betrayal as a reasonable response to my alleged mistreatment were easily contradicted by mutual friends and family members who had observed our marriage over 4 years and had never witnessed any signs of the controlling behavior she was now claiming had driven her to seek comfort elsewhere. Her mother Helen had actually called me to apologize for initially taking Camila's side and to express her disappointment in her daughter's continued refusal to accept responsibility for her actions, admitting that she'd learned additional details about the emotional affair and manipulation schemes that made it clear I'd been the wronged party throughout the entire situation. Helen's apology was particularly meaningful because it came from someone who had every reason to support her daughter but had been forced to confront the reality that Camila's version of events had been deliberately misleading and self-serving rather than an accurate representation of what had actually destroyed our marriage. The professional and social isolation Camila was experiencing seemed to be pushing her toward increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative and maintain some semblance of dignity, but each effort to shift blame or minimize her responsibility only further damaged her credibility with people who were learning the full scope of her deception and manipulation. Her colleagues at the marketing firm had begun treating her as a liability rather than a team member, with supervisors avoiding assigning her to high-profile projects or client-facing roles where her poor judgment might create additional problems for the company's reputation and professional relationships. The cascade of consequences that had resulted from her emotional affair and loyalty testing scheme served as a stark reminder that personal choices have professional ramifications, especially when those choices involve deception, manipulation, and boundary violations that reflect poorly on someone's character and decision-making abilities in ways that extend far beyond their romantic relationships into every aspect of their professional and social lives. After 8 weeks of legal proceedings during which Camila exhausted every possible avenue for reconciliation, including counseling proposals, mediation requests, and increasingly desperate promises to change her behavior and cut all contact with Marcus permanently, the divorce was finalized with her signing all papers without contest once she realized that her attempts at manipulation and guilt trips were having no effect on my resolve to end the marriage completely. Her final desperate gambit had involved threatening to contest the divorce and demand alimony based on claims that I had been financially controlling throughout our marriage, but Rodriguez quickly dismantled those arguments by pointing out that we'd maintained separate bank accounts, shared expenses equally, and that she'd actually been the one making unreasonable financial demands, including requests for expensive vacations and luxury items that stretched our budget beyond reasonable limits. The threat of a contested divorce evaporated when Camila's own attorney advised her that she had no grounds for her claims and that pursuing litigation would only result in additional legal expenses and public scrutiny of her behavior that would further damage her already compromised reputation in both professional and social circles. Her signature on the final documents came with what appeared to be genuine tears of regret, but I suspected they were more about losing the lifestyle and security our marriage had provided rather than any real remorse for the betrayal and manipulation that had made the divorce inevitable from the moment she chose to orchestrate loyalty tests while conducting emotional affairs. The relief I felt when the paperwork was complete surprised me with its intensity, confirming that the marriage had been causing more stress and anxiety than I'd realized even before discovering the full scope of her deception and the involvement of her book club conspirators in testing my commitment to someone who had already abandoned her own commitment to our relationship. Helen called me personally to apologize for her daughter's behavior and to express her disappointment in how the situation had been handled, admitting that she'd initially blamed me for being unwilling to fight for the marriage but had since learned enough details about Camila's emotional affair and manipulation schemes to understand that I'd been the victim rather than the perpetrator of the relationship's destruction. Her apology was particularly meaningful because it came from someone who had every maternal instinct to defend her daughter but had been forced to confront the reality that Camila's actions had been indefensible and that my decision to end the marriage had been not only justified but necessary for my own emotional and mental health. Helen revealed that Camila had finally admitted to the full scope of her relationship with Marcus after initially trying to minimize it as innocent workplace friendship, and that she'd also confessed to feeling pressured by her book club friends to test our marriage in ways that she now recognized had been manipulative and destructive rather than helpful or constructive. The conversation with Helen provided closure that I hadn't realized I needed, confirming that even Camila's own mother understood that the marriage had ended because of choices Camila had made rather than any failure on my part to be a supportive or committed husband throughout 4 years of what I'd believed was a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and trust. I moved into my own apartment in a different neighborhood of Phoenix, choosing a place that represented a complete fresh start rather than somewhere that might trigger memories of the life I'd built with someone who had systematically undermined that life through deception while testing my loyalty to a marriage she'd already compromised through her emotional affair with her supervisor. The apartment hunting process had been surprisingly therapeutic, allowing me to envision a future based on my own preferences and goals rather than the compromises and accommodations that had characterized my married life, particularly during the final months when Camila's behavior had become increasingly secretive and manipulative. My new place reflected choices that were entirely mine, from the minimalist furniture that contrasted with Camila's preference for elaborate decorative schemes to the home office setup that prioritized functionality over appearance, creating a space where I could focus on rebuilding my life without constant reminders of the relationship that had consumed so much of my emotional energy over the previous 4 years. The process of establishing new routines and rediscovering interests I'd neglected during the marriage revealed how much of myself I'd compromised in trying to accommodate someone whose idea of partnership involved testing and manipulation rather than honest communication and mutual support. Career opportunities that I'd previously declined because they would have required travel or schedule changes suddenly became viable options now that I didn't need to coordinate my professional decisions with someone whose own career was built on maintaining inappropriate relationships with supervisors and creating workplace drama that reflected poorly on her judgment and professionalism. Within a month of finalizing the divorce, I received a promotion opportunity that would have been impossible to pursue while married to someone who viewed my career advancement as a threat to the attention and resources she expected from our relationship, and I accepted it without hesitation since it represented exactly the kind of professional growth I'd been postponing in favor of maintaining domestic harmony with someone who had never actually been committed to building a life together. The irony wasn't lost on me that ending a marriage that had been destroyed by someone else's disloyalty and manipulation had actually freed me to pursue opportunities and experiences that would have been incompatible with the compromises and limitations that had characterized my life with Camila, whose definition of partnership had apparently involved testing my devotion while secretly exploring alternatives with her workplace supervisor and book club enablers. My social life also improved dramatically as I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the marriage, people who'd noticed Camila's controlling tendencies and manipulative behavior but had been too polite to comment directly about their concerns regarding her treatment of me and her obvious discomfort whenever I spent time with anyone outside her carefully curated social circle. These friends welcomed me back into their lives with genuine enthusiasm and relief, admitting that they'd watched with concern as Camila gradually isolated me from independent relationships and activities that didn't revolve around her needs and preferences, using subtle guilt trips and emotional manipulation to ensure that my social energy remained focused primarily on meeting her expectations rather than maintaining the broader friendships that had been important to me before our marriage. The contrast between spending time with people who actually enjoyed my company versus someone who had been constantly testing and evaluating my worthiness as a partner was stark and enlightening, revealing how much emotional energy I'd been wasting on trying to satisfy someone whose standards kept shifting depending on what her book club friends were reading and what psychological theories they were experimenting with that week. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Camila sent a final email acknowledging that she had made serious mistakes and accepting full responsibility for the destruction of our marriage through her emotional affair and the loyalty testing scheme that had backfired so spectacularly, but I chose not to respond since she'd already demonstrated through months of attempted manipulation and blame shifting that her apologies were more about relieving her own guilt than expressing genuine remorse for the pain she'd caused. I deleted the email without saving it and blocked her contact information completely, recognizing that any continued communication would only provide her with opportunities for additional manipulation attempts and prevent me from moving forward with the new life I was building based on honesty, respect, and genuine partnership with people who valued those qualities. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I encountered Jasmine at a grocery store in Scottsdale where she approached me with obvious hesitation and what appeared to be genuine remorse, apologizing profusely for her role in orchestrating the loyalty test that had destroyed my marriage and revealing that the book club had completely dissolved in the aftermath of their failed psychological experiment, with members blaming each other for the catastrophic consequences that had resulted from their amateur relationship counseling attempts. She explained that the group had fractured along lines of accountability, with some members feeling manipulated by her into participating in what they now recognized had been a cruel scheme disguised as helpful relationship advice, while others defended their involvement by claiming they genuinely believed they were helping Camila strengthen her marriage rather than providing her with cover for an emotional affair that had already compromised the relationship they thought they were protecting. Jasmine admitted that the loyalty test had been entirely her idea, born from her own relationship insecurities and a misguided belief that testing partners was a legitimate psychological strategy she'd read about in self-help books rather than recognizing it as manipulation that violated the basic trust and respect that healthy relationships require to function properly. She revealed that she'd been projecting her own fears about her boyfriend's commitment onto Camila's marriage, convincing herself and the other book club members that orchestrating fake divorce requests was somehow equivalent to the compatibility tests and relationship assessments that legitimate counselors might recommend for couples experiencing genuine communication problems. The conversation was awkward but illuminating, providing insight into how the book club had functioned as an echo chamber where poorly informed relationship advice was amplified and validated without consideration for the real-world consequences of implementing manipulative strategies on actual people with real relationships that could be permanently damaged by such interference. I listened to her explanation without offering forgiveness or absolution, making it clear that while I appreciated her honesty about the group's role in the disaster, the loyalty test had simply accelerated a confrontation that was inevitable given Camila's emotional affair, and that their interference had prevented any possibility of addressing our marital problems through mature, private communication rather than public manipulation and workplace drama. Meanwhile, my own life had transformed in ways that confirmed ending the marriage had been not just the right decision but the best possible outcome for my personal and professional development, with career opportunities, social connections, and personal interests flourishing in ways that had been impossible during my marriage to someone who viewed my independence and growth as threats to her control and security within our relationship. The promotion I'd accepted had led to additional responsibilities and recognition that positioned me for even greater advancement within the analytics field. Opportunities that would have been difficult to pursue while married to someone whose definition of partnership involved constant emotional demands and expectations that my career remained subordinate to her need for attention and validation from both me and her social circle of enablers and co-conspirators. My renewed friendships had evolved into a social network based on mutual respect and genuine enjoyment of each other's company rather than the careful navigation of someone else's emotional landmines and manipulative tendencies that had characterized my social life during the marriage, when every interaction had to be filtered through Camila's approval and her comfort level with my maintaining independent relationships outside her sphere of influence. A chance encounter with Emma at a professional networking event revealed that Camila had eventually changed jobs after the workplace scandal with Marcus had made her position at the marketing firm untenable, and that she'd reportedly entered therapy to address what Emma diplomatically described as ongoing issues with personal accountability and relationship patterns that had extended beyond just our marriage to affect her professional relationships and friendships as well. According to Emma, Marcus had ultimately been terminated from the marketing firm after additional complaints about his conduct emerged during the HR investigation, and the company had implemented comprehensive policies about workplace relationships and social media conduct that were directly inspired by the chaos their inappropriate relationship had created for both their careers and the firm's professional reputation. The information about Camila's therapy was particularly interesting because it suggested she might finally be addressing the underlying issues that had driven her to test relationships rather than participate in them honestly, though Emma noted that even her therapy seemed to be approached as another project to manage rather than genuine self-reflection about the patterns of manipulation and control that had characterized her interactions with both romantic partners and friends throughout her adult life. I felt no satisfaction in learning about Camila's continued struggles, but I also felt no guilt about the consequences she was experiencing as a result of choices she'd made freely and defended persistently even after their destructive impact became undeniable to everyone around her, including her own mother and former friends who had initially supported her version of events. The contrast between my thriving post-divorce life and her apparent ongoing difficulties served as validation that I'd been right to end the marriage decisively rather than attempting to repair a relationship with someone whose fundamental approach to partnerships involved testing, manipulation, and emotional blackmail rather than the honest communication and mutual respect that healthy relationships require to survive and flourish over time. 6 months later, I realized I wasn't healing from the end of my marriage but actually thriving because it had ended, having learned crucial lessons about maintaining boundaries, recognizing manipulation, and prioritizing my own emotional health over attempts to satisfy someone whose standards and expectations shifted constantly based on whatever psychological theories her social circle was experimenting with during their amateur relationship counseling sessions that had caused such devastating harm to real people's actual lives and genuine partnerships. The experience had taught me to trust my instincts about manipulative behavior and to value relationships based on consistency, honesty, and mutual respect rather than the emotional roller coaster of someone who viewed partnerships as psychological experiments to be conducted through elaborate tests and schemes designed more to validate their own insecurities than to build genuine intimacy and trust between committed partners. My new understanding of healthy relationship dynamics had attracted people into my life who shared similar values about honesty and direct communication, creating a social and professional network that supported my growth rather than constantly challenging my worth through tests and evaluations disguised as expressions of love or concern for our future together. The relief I continued to feel about ending the marriage confirmed that I'd made the right choice not just for my immediate well-being but for my long-term happiness and personal development, proving that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from someone whose idea of love involves manipulation, control, and the kind of psychological games that destroy trust and intimacy rather than building the foundation for a lifelong partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection.